My life turned upside down when my dad's most treasured watch went missing. What I didn't know then was that my stepsister had stolen it to pay for her car troubles. And with my stepmom's help, she planted the blame on me. Dad didn't hesitate. He called me unstable just like my mom and threw me out of the house when I was only 17. Please stay with me as I share how it all unfolded. I grew up in a house where silence was often louder than words. My dad was strict, the kind of man who valued reputation more than comfort. After my mom left, he remarried quickly, and that's when everything shifted. My stepmom came into our lives with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She had this way of speaking that made her sound caring, but underneath I always felt something sharp and cold. Then there was my stepsister. She was only a year older than me, but you'd think she was royalty. Dad adored her, showered her with gifts, overlooked her mistakes. She had her own car at 18, while I was still begging to borrow the family's old one. Whenever she overspent, Dad laughed it off as if it were part of growing up. For me, one slip, even forgetting to do a chore, was treated as if it proved I wasn't right in the head, just like Mom. That watch was the one thing Dad cared about more than anything else. A gold watch passed down from Grandpa, polished until it gleamed, kept locked in its case like treasure. He told us 100 times never to touch it. I never even dared to look at it too long. It wasn't just a watch to him. It was pride, heritage, proof that he was the responsible son in the family. Then one morning the house shifted. Dad stormed into the living room, face red, voice low but sharp. The watch was gone. He paced like a lion in a cage. My stepmom placed a hand on his arm, whispering things I couldn't hear. My stepsister sat on the couch, arms crossed, acting shocked but with a nervous edge in her eyes. At first I thought it was just another storm I could stand through. But then Dad turned to me. His gaze burned straight through. He didn't ask, he accused. He said I'd stolen it, that I was desperate, that I was losing control the way my mother had. I tried to defend myself, but every word only made him angrier. My stepmom pretended to calm him down, though every sentence she spoke tightened the rope around my neck. My stepsister widened her eyes and shook her head like she couldn't believe I would do such a thing. Then Dad brought out the watch. He held it in his hand, said he found it hidden in my drawer. My chest hollowed out. I knew instantly I'd been set up. Still, he didn't see doubt, only betrayal. He shouted that he couldn't have a thief under his roof. Worse, he said I was showing the same madness as my mom, the woman he spoke of like a ghost with no dignity left. I begged him to listen, but he wouldn't. That night he told me to leave, and I walked out of the house with nothing but a small bag, the echo of his words clinging to me like chains. When my dad remarried, the house no longer felt like the place I grew up in. Everything familiar became unsettled, as if the walls themselves leaned toward her voice. She wasn't cruel in obvious ways. Instead, she carried herself with calm authority, a softness that made people drop their guard. Dad fell for it completely. Bit by bit, she positioned herself not just as his partner but as his advisor, his confidant. Soon his decisions started echoing her opinions. At first I thought I was imagining it, but gradually the shift became impossible to ignore. If I wanted to explain something, Dad's eyes flicked toward her before he answered. If I made a mistake, even a small one, she would sigh quietly, tilt her head, and he would immediately turn it into a lecture. It was as though she had slipped her hands into the steering wheel of the family, and he believed she knew the road better than anyone else. My stepsister thrived in this new order. She lived like rules were written for someone else. Shopping sprees, late returns, reckless driving. None of it mattered. Whenever Dad noticed her carelessness, his anger dissolved before it could even form. One excuse, a pout, maybe a hug, and she was forgiven. If her car broke down because she neglected it, money appeared without hesitation. If she demanded new clothes, Dad acted like saying no would be cruel. Meanwhile, my world shrank. Every action of mine seemed to raise suspicion. If I stayed in my room, I was antisocial. If I spoke up at dinner, I was argumentative. If I looked upset, Dad's mouth tightened and he muttered something about me being too much like my mother. I learned to measure each word, each step, yet nothing changed the way he looked at me, like I was a problem waiting to happen. The unfairness settled heavily between us. She wasted without consequence. I saved and still earned criticism. She laughed late into the night after rolling in from a party. I folded laundry and was told I looked ungrateful. I could feel the lines being drawn, a contrast so sharp it cut into me every single day. Still, I kept hoping he would see the difference. I didn't skip classes, I didn't run off with friends, I didn't ask for anything more than what was necessary. But it didn't matter. To him, her mistakes were harmless, while my smallest misstep carried the weight of my mother's supposed instability. It was as if he had decided who we both were, and nothing either of us did could change his mind. That imbalance was the soil where everything poisonous began to grow. I knew deep down that the day would come when his blind trust in them and his suspicion toward me would collide. I just didn't know how cruelly it would happen or how completely it would change my life. The watch was more than an object to my father. It was the thread that tied him to the man he admired most. My grandfather had given it to him when he became an adult, and Dad treated it as if it held his entire identity. He kept it in a case on his dresser, never hidden but never out of reach either. I saw him take it out every weekend, rubbing the metal with a cloth until it shone like fire under the lamp. He'd say things like, "This isn't just jewelry, it's legacy." I never dared touch it. Even standing too close to the case made me nervous. My stepsister, however, would glance at it now and then, her expression unreadable. Sometimes I caught her lingering when Dad wasn't in the room, but I brushed it off. Then one morning the air in the house was different, heavy before anyone spoke. Dad's voice cut through the silence, sharp and unsteady. The case on his dresser was open. The watch was gone. His face drained of color, then hardened with fury. He tore through drawers, looked under cushions, even lifted rugs. Each movement grew wilder, as though he could force it to reappear. I stood in the hallway, frozen. My stepmom stepped forward, laying a hand on his shoulder, speaking low enough that I couldn't catch the words. Her tone carried that practiced calm, the kind she always used when guiding him toward her conclusions. My stepsister sat nearby, wide-eyed, biting her lip as if she were horrified. She clutched her phone, muttering she had no idea what could have happened. The act was too smooth, too polished. The tension spread like smoke. Every time Dad glanced around the room, his gaze landed longer on me than anyone else. My skin prickled. I felt the walls shrinking, the floor shifting beneath me. He muttered about betrayal, about disrespect, about how someone under his roof dared to violate what meant most to him. I wanted to shout that it wasn't me, that I hadn't even touched the case. But before I could gather the courage, my stepmom's eyes slid toward me, and her whisper carried just loud enough for him to catch. My stepsister shook her head, muttering how awful it all was, as though she too couldn't believe it. I knew then that I was no longer just standing in that hallway. I was standing in the center of a storm they were building around me. And Dad was already listening more to the wind than to reason. The watch wasn't only missing, it had become the fuse for something far worse. It started with a passing comment from my stepsister at dinner. She sighed, twirling her fork, and muttered something about her car giving her trouble again. Dad immediately asked what was wrong, and she brushed it off with a shrug, saying repairs were expensive and she'd figure something out. His brows knit with worry, but before he could press, my stepmom steered the conversation elsewhere. At the time I thought nothing of it. Looking back, it was the first step in a script I hadn't realized was being written. A few nights later, while I was heading to bed, I caught the sound of my stepsister's voice drifting through the thin walls. It was late, too late for casual chatting. She spoke in a low tone, the kind people use when they don't want to be overheard. I paused, listening carefully. The words that reached me made my stomach tighten. Something about payment, and "I'll have it soon." The reply on the other end was muffled, but the edge in her voice gave away more than the words themselves. She wasn't just talking to a friend. She was negotiating. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Maybe I'd misheard, maybe I was imagining things. But unease stayed with me, circling in the back of my mind. Then came the night when I couldn't mistake it anymore. I passed by the kitchen on my way upstairs and stopped at the sound of hushed voices. My stepmom and stepsister were leaning close together, their faces half shadowed by the dim light above the stove. I couldn't make out every word, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, conspiratorial. My stepmom's whisper carried fragments like, "He'll believe it," and "Just let me handle it." My stepsister nodded, biting her lip, her expression tense. I froze, heart pounding, but forced myself to keep walking before they noticed me. I told myself not to assume the worst, but something inside me already knew. The next day, Dad stormed into my room with that same rage I had seen before. In his hand was the gold watch, the very one that had disappeared. He said he found it hidden in my drawer. My throat went dry, my body cold. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even been near it. Yet there it was, gleaming in his hand like undeniable proof. I tried to explain, to insist it wasn't mine, but the look in his eyes told me he had already decided. He didn't see a frightened teenager staring back at him. He saw guilt, dishonor, betrayal. The trap had snapped shut, and no matter how loudly I protested, the walls of his judgment closed tighter around me. In that moment I realized they had been building this carefully, piece by piece, until the final blow left me powerless. The door flew open so hard it struck the wall, and my father stood there, gripping the watch as though it were a weapon. His face was red, his jaw tight, his whole body shaking with fury. He didn't pause, didn't give me a chance to speak. His voice came down like a hammer. "You thought you could hide this from me?" I stammered, confused, my hands lifted in defense. But he wasn't looking for answers. In his eyes, the verdict was already decided. He threw the watch onto my bed, the metal clattering against the blanket. "You stole from me. From this family." The words cut so deeply I couldn't breathe. Behind him, my stepmom appeared, her tone soft as if she wanted to soothe him. "Maybe there's some misunderstanding," she murmured, placing her hand gently on his arm. But her eyes flicked toward me with a cold glint. Her words didn't calm him. They poured oil on the fire. Each phrase disguised as fairness only sharpened his anger. My stepsister lingered at the doorway, wide-eyed, her hand covering her mouth. She gasped as if she were heartbroken, whispering, "I can't believe you do this." Her voice cracked perfectly, like she was watching a tragedy unfold. The sight of her fake sorrow twisted my stomach. I tried to defend myself, voice trembling, words tumbling over each other. I swore I hadn't touched it, begged him to think about what he was saying. But the more I pleaded, the louder he became. His voice rose to a roar, echoing through the house. And then came the words that broke me completely. "You're just like her. Just like your mother. Crazy, dishonest, dangerous." The room seemed to spin. It wasn't just about the watch anymore. He was tearing open every wound, dragging my mother's name into the fire and shoving me in after it. My chest felt hollow, like all the air had been stolen from me. I tried one last time, reaching out toward him, but he pulled back as if my touch would burn him. His eyes were full of disgust. "Get out. You're not welcome here." Silence followed, broken only by the sound of my stepsister's faint sob and my stepmom whispering that maybe it was for the best. My father's face was set in stone. No hesitation. No second chances. I packed what little I could into a bag with shaking hands. As I walked past them, my father refused to look at me. My stepmom held him close, whispering something I couldn't hear. My stepsister turned away, still pretending to cry. When the door shut behind me, the weight of his rejection pressed down so hard I could barely stand. In one night, I had lost my home, my father, and the chance to prove I wasn't what he believed me to be. I walked away from that house with nothing but a bag over my shoulder and the sting of my father's words still ringing in my ears. I had no plan, no money, and nowhere to turn. The night air felt colder than it should have, pressing against me as though the world itself had closed its doors. The first place I ended up was a friend's couch. Their family took me in quietly, no questions asked, but I never let myself feel comfortable. I worked every odd job I could find, washing dishes, stacking shelves, sweeping floors, anything that would put a few dollars in my pocket. Each shift left me exhausted, but at least it gave me a sense that I could stand on my own, even if only barely. Those first months were the hardest. I replayed the scene over and over, wondering if I could have said something different, if there was some way I could have stopped him from believing the worst. Every answer circled back to the same truth. It wouldn't have mattered. His mind had already been made up long before the watch was ever missing. That realization hollowed me out, but it also hardened something inside me. It was around that time that my mother found me. I hadn't spoken to her in years, not since my father painted her as unstable. I expected her to be the broken figure he always described, but instead I found a woman who carried her pain quietly, who had been cast aside by his judgment just as I had. She wasn't unhinged, she was simply human, flawed, but not the villain I'd been told to fear. Sitting across from her for the first time in so long, I felt both anger for what I'd been made to believe and relief that I finally saw the truth. She helped me when she could, though she didn't have much herself. More than anything, she gave me something I hadn't felt in years, the sense that I wasn't alone. Slowly, I began to build a life that didn't orbit around my father's approval. A small apartment, a steady routine, work that kept the lights on. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. The silence between us stretched into years. No calls, no letters, no apologies. I heard bits of news through relatives, holidays, family gatherings I wasn't invited to, but I learned to stop waiting for him to reach out. My absence in his world seemed to suit him just fine. Still, every so often I wondered if he ever thought about me, if he ever replayed that night the way I did. I doubted it. He had chosen his side and I had been forced to find my own. By the time I turned 21, my life looked nothing like the frightened 17-year-old who had been pushed out with nothing. I worked steady hours, kept my own place, and carried myself with a strength I'd earned through hardship. I didn't need my father's approval anymore, though the scar of his rejection never faded. One morning a letter arrived from my grandfather. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, as if every word mattered. He was turning 75 and wanted his entire family present for the celebration. His words weren't a request, they carried the weight of expectation. He had always been the anchor in our family, the one person my father still looked up to without question. Ignoring him was impossible. For days I turned the invitation over in my mind. The thought of stepping back into that house of whispers and lies made my chest tighten. I hadn't seen my father, my stepmother, or my stepsister since the night I was thrown out. Part of me wanted to stay away forever to prove I didn't need them. Yet another part, quieter but persistent, urged me to go. This wasn't about them. It was about my grandfather, the only one who had never treated me like a shadow. Finally, I made my decision. I would go. But the choice left me restless. Each day closer to the event wound my nerves tighter. I pictured the looks I would get, the way their smiles might freeze the moment I entered the room. Would my father glare at me the way he had that night? Would my stepmother find a way to twist my presence into something ugly? Would my stepsister play innocent, pretending nothing had ever happened? The questions circled endlessly, leaving me unsettled. Still, beneath the unease there was a current of resolve. I wasn't the same teenager they had broken down. Whatever happened, I would walk into that gathering with my head high. When the day finally arrived, I dressed carefully, my hands steady even though my stomach churned. The drive felt longer than it was, each mile pulling me closer to the confrontation I had avoided for years. By the time I pulled up outside the venue, my palms were damp against the steering wheel. I sat there for a moment, staring at the entrance, heart pounding. I knew the moment I stepped inside, everything I had buried would rise to the surface. My grandfather's milestone should have been about him, but in my gut I sensed it would turn into something else entirely. The suspense weighed heavy. I couldn't predict how the night would unfold, only that it would not pass quietly. I walked into the hall with steady steps, though inside my pulse thudded like a drum. The room was bright with decorations, laughter echoing from corners, but the moment my presence registered, voices dipped. A few relatives glanced my way, then leaned toward each other, whispering behind polite smiles. It was as though I had carried a storm in with me, one everyone noticed but no one dared name. My stepmother was the first to spot me. Her expression hardened for a split second before she forced it into something resembling warmth. The edges of her smile didn't move her eyes. She adjusted the necklace around her throat as if bracing herself. My stepsister glanced up briefly, then quickly looked down at her plate, pretending to fuss with her phone. The flush in her cheeks betrayed her discomfort. My father didn't speak at all. He shifted in his chair, his posture rigid, his eyes refusing to linger on me for more than a second. Then I saw my grandfather. He rose from his seat with a grin that lit up his entire face, his arms outstretched as though no years had passed. His embrace was firm, grounding, and in that moment I felt something close to relief. He asked how I had been, his tone genuine, his pride in me undimmed. It was the first voice in the room that carried no tension. We all gathered at the long table, dishes passed around, silverware clinking, but beneath the polite chatter was a silence no one acknowledged. Every word spoken seemed cautious, as if everyone was tiptoeing along a thin rope stretched over old wounds. My stepmother asked questions in her smooth, careful way, never mentioning the years I'd been absent. My stepsister laughed at jokes that weren't funny, her eyes darting anywhere but toward mine. My father ate in silence, his jaw clenched, his hand tightening around his glass every time I spoke. I responded evenly, my voice steady, though the weight of their stares pressed down. It felt like sitting in a play where everyone had memorized the lines but none of us dared break the script. The conversation circled around safe topics, work, school, travel, yet none of it mattered. What lay unsaid filled the spaces between us more than any words could. Through it all, my grandfather kept stealing glances at me, his eyes kind but sharp as if he knew the current running under the table. He lifted his glass now and then, smiling at others, but there was something in his gaze that suggested patience, as though he was waiting for the right moment. The evening stretched, food replaced by dessert, laughter rising again but brittle. Beneath the clatter of plates and glasses, I felt the anticipation growing. Everyone was waiting for his speech, the reason we had all gathered. The air grew thick with the sense that something significant was about to break through the practiced harmony. The clinking of glasses hushed the room as my grandfather rose slowly to his feet. His smile was gentle, his posture steady, and for a moment it seemed like any other birthday toast. Relatives leaned in, expecting kind words about family, tradition, and age. But when he cleared his throat, the tone shifted. His eyes swept the table, pausing on each of us, lingering just a little longer on the faces of my father, my stepmother, and my stepsister. "I've reached 75 years, he began, voice rich with authority, "and at this age I have little patience for secrets." A ripple of unease moved through the room. My stepmother's fork stilled. My stepsister lowered her gaze. My father's jaw tightened. Grandpa set his glass down and placed both hands on the table. "You all remember the watch," he said, calm but firm. "The one passed to me by my father and later to my son." A silence fell so complete it pressed against the walls. "I know where it went. I've known for years." The words landed like a thunderclap. Chairs shifted. Murmurs started and stopped. My father's color drained from his face as though the ground beneath him had given way. My stepmother's lips parted, ready to form an objection, but no sound came. My stepsister's fingers shook against her napkin. Grandpa's gaze locked on her. "It was taken, pawned in exchange for money to cover foolish debts." A mechanic let slip the truth when pressed. "And when I tracked it down, I bought it back quietly." He pulled something from his pocket, the gold glint unmistakable under the lights. The watch lay in his palm, not an accusation but as evidence no one could deny. Gasps echoed around the table. Cousins stared, aunts and uncles exchanged startled looks. My father leaned back, pale and rigid, his eyes darting between his daughter and his wife, the pieces clicking together in his mind with brutal clarity. Grandpa didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calm was more devastating than any shout. "Blame was cast where it did not belong," he continued. "A child paid the price for a lie crafted in this very house. I watched, hoping the truth might come out, but it never did. So tonight it will." The mask my stepmother always wore began to slip, her practiced composure faltering as whispers surged around her. My stepsister trembled openly now, her eyes glossy, her face drained of the arrogance she once carried so easily. The betrayal hung heavy in the air, undeniable, exposed under my grandfather's steady gaze. The silence that followed my grandfather's words was sharper than any argument. My father's face had lost all color, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and shame. For the first time he looked smaller, diminished under the weight of his own mistake. He had torn me from his life for nothing, and now every relative at that table knew it. My stepmother opened her mouth, her voice low and quick, reaching for excuses, but Grandpa cut her off with a raised hand. His eyes were steady, his tone final. "Enough. The truth is plain. No more lies." The authority in his voice left no space for her practiced charm. Across from me my stepsister crumbled. Her shoulders shook and her words tumbled out between gasps. She admitted pawning the watch, confessed to the scheme, her eyes darting toward me as though seeking forgiveness she didn't deserve. Each word from her lips made the air heavier, every admission tightening the knot in my father's chest. I didn't speak. I sat there, still letting it all wash over me. The sting of memory returned with every detail. The night I was accused, the slam of the door behind me, the years of silence. Their confessions didn't undo any of it. Nothing could. My father finally turned toward me, his voice trembling in a way I had never heard before. "I was wrong," he whispered. "I should have trusted you." His words faltered, but I didn't need to hear more. Regret filled his eyes, but regret couldn't erase what he had done. He had chosen to believe the worst of me, and that choice had carved a divide that couldn't be bridged. I rose from my chair slowly, steady on my feet. Around us, relatives whispered, but I barely noticed. My father reached as if to stop me, but I stepped back, leaving his hand hanging in the air. His apology came too late. Without another word, I walked out of that room, the sound of my shoes against the floor louder than the chatter behind me. I didn't need to shout, didn't need revenge. My strength was in leaving them to face the wreckage they had created. Behind me, I knew my father sat in disgrace, burdened by a truth he could never undo. I didn't look back. The past had already taken enough from me. Do you think I did the right thing by walking away from them forever? Or should I have let my father's apology mean something? I'd really love to know your thoughts on this. And if you enjoy stories like this one, stay tuned for more. You won't want to miss what's coming next.